This is Still Unanswered. I'm Claire Mendoza. Tonight, we go back to a winter in Chicago that the city still can't shake. December 1956, and the disappearance and then the bodies of two young sisters, Barbara and Patricia Grimes. You probably know the outline already. They went to see an Elvis movie, they didn't come home, and weeks later, two girls were found naked in the snow. But the shape of this case, the contradictions, the sightings, the coerced confession, the anonymous taunts, the shape of it is stranger and meaner than the headlines let on. This episode is somber. It's about grief, investigative failure, and the ways a community tried to make sense of a horror that felt impossible. Cold open, January 22nd, 1957. A construction worker named Leonard Prescott is driving German Church Road near County Line Road in Willow Springs. He notices something behind a guardrail that at first glance looks like a discarded mannequin. He goes home, brings his wife back, and when she gets close, she faints. Two girls, naked, lying close together in the snow, exposed to the January cold. The press runs the photos. Chicago holds its breath. We're going to go back now to the night when they left their house on South Damon, walked to the Brighton Theater, and stepped into a story that the city has been trying to read for nearly 70 years.
Claire, before we go back, can I say just one thing about that discovery? The image of bodies in the snow stayed with people. It wasn't just shock. It rewired how the city thought about its children. That is part of the case's power and its tragedy.
Right, Lewis, and that image, it lodged in people's minds, partly because of the girls' youth, partly because of what they represented. Elvis posters on bedroom walls, pin-ups, school uniforms. Let's start there. Tell us who Barbara and Patricia were, as best we know.
Barbara Jean Grimes was born May 5, 1941, about 15 years old in December of 1956. Patricia Kathleen Grimes, born December 31, 1943, sometimes reported as 12, sometimes 13, depending on the source. They were middle children in a working-class Catholic family at 3634 South Damon, Brighton or McKinley Park neighborhood. Barbara was described as outgoing, a good student at Thomas Kelly High School. Patricia was quieter, a St. Maurice student, very devout, very much the dutiful younger sister. Both were, as the papers would later put it, devoted fans of Elvis Presley. They'd seen Love Me Tender more than once at the Brighton Theater. Locals said 10 to a dozen times. Little details like that later turned into motives in the public imagination, but they were also just teenage girls letting themselves like music.
You say turned into motives, and that matters, because in the days after they disappeared, official reaction leaned hard into a runaway theory. Police at first treated it like a juvenile disappearance. Two Elvis-loving girls who might have run away. Loretta Grimes, their mother, rejected that immediately. She insisted her daughters would not run off. She told reporters she wouldn't accept that explanation. Lewis, was the police conclusion reasonable given the period?
In the context of 1950s policing, it was common. There was a cultural tendency to pathologize teen behavior, especially girls, as delinquency. Post-war anxieties about atomic youth, rock and roll, curfews, moral panic. So the police weren't operating in a vacuum. They reflected community biases. That doesn't excuse it. Early dismissal as runaways delayed certain lines of inquiry and shifted resources towards search and publicity instead of forensically examining the theater route and close associates.
Let's walk the night with them. December 28, 1956. They ask Loretta for permission to go to the Brighton. She gives them $2.50, enough for 2 tickets and snacks, and tells Barbara to keep 50 cents hidden in case they stay for the second showing. They leave around 7:30 p.m. to be home by 11:30 p.m. The last confirmed sighting puts them in the theater in the concession line around 9:30, and most accounts place the end of the second show near 11 or 11:15 p.m. At some point, they either walked or took the bus home. There are multiple witness claims after that. Tell me about the bus and the green Buick reports, Lewis.
Several people reported seeing 2 girls like the Grimes sisters on an eastbound Archer Avenue bus after the second show, a CTA bus driver among them. Witnesses said they got off at Western Avenue around 11:05 p.m., which is odd because that's not the stop nearest their home. Another witness, a young man named Roger Menard, recalled seeing 2 girls walking behind him on Archer and a late-model green Buick pull up alongside them. But his account doesn't clearly say whether they entered the car. These are fragments. In cold cases, fragments become competing narratives when investigators or journalists fill gaps with assumption.
And assumptions are dangerous. Within hours, the neighborhood is worried. Within days, it's a citywide search. And then the sightings start. Dozens of them, hundreds of tips. Some genuine attempts to help, volunteers, civic groups, flyers. And then a swirl of false leads. People who say they saw the girls in diners, bus depots, even as far as Nashville. Elvis himself gets involved. There's a public plea televised around January 19th, urging any runaway to go home. That plea is part earnest, part spectacle. Lewis, what effect did all this publicity have on the investigation?
Publicity had 2 big effects. 1, it generated more tips, some useful, many not, which clogged investigators. 2, it shifted the narrative. The Elvis angle fit existing fears and created an interpretive frame. These girls were victims of a new, dangerous youth culture. That frame made some people more likely to believe sightings even when the forensic window later suggested otherwise. The more a case enters the national imagination, the more it attracts both help and noise.
Which brings us to a central tension in the case. Many eyewitness sightings happening after the girls had almost certainly died. The autopsies later indicated a time of death within roughly 5 hours of their last confirmed sighting. That would make a lot of the later reports impossible. But families and the public clung to sightings because they offered hope. How do you reconcile that, Lewis?
You reconcile it by separating human hope from forensic reality. People want to believe. Mothers want to believe their daughters ran off and will come back. Witness reliability, especially under the pressure of a high-profile search and months of media, is low. Memory contaminates. Mistaken identities happen. And then there are deliberate hoaxes. Worst of all, if a coroner's conclusions are uncertain or poorly explained, it leaves an opening for plausible alternative narratives. In this case, the autopsy, based on stomach contents and condition of the bodies, pointed to death within hours. That alone should have narrowed the field of leads, but it didn't.
Let's get to January 22nd, the discovery. The Prescotts find the bodies near Devil's Creek, behind a guardrail. Both naked, lined up in the snow, with animal chewing. Garden Variety reporting later described the scene as shocking and gruesome. But we have to be careful with words like that. The forensic detail is, in many ways, the hinge of this case. What did the autopsies say, succinctly, and then the contradictions that followed?
Officially, the coroner's office concluded time of death was on December 28 or 29, within about 5 hours of the last sighting. Cause of death was listed as secondary shock due to exposure and possibly additional trauma. But when you read deeper, injuries are more complex. Barbara had numerous puncture wounds, bruises, and signs that some form of blunt or sharp trauma may have occurred. Patricia showed bruising that some read as strangulation. Then there's the question of sexual assault. Early public statements downplayed it, but later investigators, and people like Harry Gloss from the coroner's office, argued the girls had been beaten and sexually assaulted before death. So you have a sanitized public version and a messier private version in the files.
Harry Gloss publicly disagreed with the official soft pedaling. He insisted the wounds suggested torture, sadistic behavior, and that authorities were deliberately withholding details. Why would officials suppress information like that if they had it?
There are several possibilities. In that era, families, especially Catholic families in working-class neighborhoods, were often shielded from the worst details out of a misguided sense of decency. Public officials also worried about creating a moral panic. Another factor is investigative strategy. At times, police withhold details to test confessions or leads. But withholding can also undermine public trust, and, importantly, it can be weaponized by skeptics to suggest cover-ups.
And then the confessions. Benny, sometimes spelled Benny, Bedwell, a drifter, described by some as physically resembling Elvis. He was interrogated, confessed, and then recanted, saying he was beaten and coerced. There were bruises on him, inconsistent statements, and prosecutors eventually dropped the case. Lewis, how do you evaluate the Bedwell episode?
Bedwell's confession has all the hallmarks of a false confession obtained under duress. Long hours of interrogation, physical coercion alleged, factual inaccuracies in his story, wrong times, wrong disposal details, and then a recantation. Medical reports of bruising are worrying. In the 1950s, interrogation standards were less protective. Police frequently extracted confessions from vulnerable men. Legally and ethically, his confession was weak evidence and would not hold up today without corroboration.
But for the public, and for some investigators, Bedwell became a focal point. He got headlines. He produced a narrative that people wanted to close. Then there's the anonymous caller in May 1957, the man who called Loretta, mocked police, and said something private. He described the youngest girl's toes as crossed at the feet. That detail was confirmed in the autopsy. That caller has never been identified. How do we weigh that chilling piece of evidence?
Those detail-specific taunts are among the most haunting elements. If the caller genuinely knew the toes were crossed, that narrows the field. Either the caller had access to the scene, which suggests involvement, or to investigative documents, which suggests a leak, or the caller was someone who'd heard the detail through other channels. But remember, in a high-profile case, private details can leak quickly, to reporters, to police files, sometimes inadvertently. It's a strong lead, but it's not proof on its own.
We also have the pattern that made people across Chicago and beyond worry. The Schwessler-Peterson murders a year earlier. 3 boys who vanished after movies, found naked and murdered in a forest preserve in 1955. The parallels made detectives suspect a serial danger, a predatory link. James Hennigan, a retired detective, thinks there's connection potential. Lewis, how plausible is a link between those killings and the Grimes sisters?
Plausible, but unproven. Similarities exist. Children vanishing after movie outings, bodies found naked in semi-rural dumps. But similar doesn't equal same offender. Geographic mobility, different victim profiles, and the passage of time matter. Importantly, we lack conclusive forensic links, DNA, unique modus operandi that matches, or a confession placing the same person at both scenes. In the mid-1950s, forensic science wasn't up to providing that kind of connective tissue. So retired detectives can make reasonable arguments, but they remain hypotheses.
And hypotheses breed more hypotheses. Theories, in this case, multiply. Predator known to the girls, a stranger sadist, multiple perpetrators, or an organized group, or a cover-up by authorities. Which theories survive scrutiny, and which are more reflective of cultural anxieties?
The known predator theory is persuasive because Loretta insisted her girls wouldn't get into a stranger's car. Family testimony like that matters. The stranger sadists theory is also plausible. Predatory men loitered near theaters and bars. The multiple perpetrators theory gets traction in rumor networks but requires corroboration. The cover-up theory often grows from investigative mistakes and withheld information. Sometimes it's a real cover-up. Sometimes it's the result of incompetence. The key is evidence, and this case, frustratingly, is short on airtight evidence.
Let's slow down and pick apart a few of those components. First, the sightings. So many people reported seeing the girls in places that, if the autopsy timing is right, they couldn't possibly have been. How does that happen? We heard bus drivers, employment agency clerks, even calls to other families. What's your read on the preponderance of sightings?
Mass suggestion, misidentification, and the power of publicity. People were already primed to look for two young blonde or brown-haired girls. In dense, late-night urban spaces, dozens of girls could look similar. Employment agency clerks might honestly think they've seen them. Phone calls are a particular problem. An anxious mind hearing a voice may project. There's also the phenomenon of people inserting themselves into cases, either to help or to gain attention. So while a handful of sightings could be true, the majority are unreliable without corroborating evidence.
And then there are the things that can't be explained away. The anonymous letter to Ann Landers saying the girls were forced into a car, a partial plate, and then nothing. The May phone call with the crossed toes. Those linger. It gets even uglier when gossip becomes fact. Neighborhood rumors that the girls had been seen flirting outside bars. That's victim blaming. We need to avoid that.
Absolutely. In historical cases, we must be careful not to reproduce misogynistic rumor as evidence. Stories that teenage girls were hanging around bars or asking for trouble often originate in middle-class moralizing or in attempts to explain an investigator's error. The core obligation is to center the victim's humanity, not the speculative morality play.
Let's talk method. Investigative missteps. You mentioned earlier that early runaway assumptions might have delayed other inquiries. What specific failures did you see, looking back?
A few stand out. Failure to rigorously secure the Brighton Theater and its staff as a crime scene. Not immediately focusing on precise timelines for bus travel and drivers. Insufficient follow-up on the green Buick leads. Allowing media leaks of private autopsy details without controlling the narrative, and mishandled interrogations that produced unreliable confessions. Combined, these errors create a case that's easy to pick apart in hindsight.
And then there's the question of disclosures. Why the coroner's office might have softened public statements. Harry Gloss blasted that. If the public narrative minimizes sexual assault, that shapes the search and the charge of urgency. The family's grief is also a through line here. Loretta never accepted the runaway story. Her pain. How do we make sure we honor that in telling the story?
We honor it by giving it central space. Loretta fought publicly. She demanded police accountability. And she had instincts about her daughters that proved, in many ways, correct. The grief of siblings like James Grimes, who decades later told reporters he still thinks about nieces he never had. Those personal details are the human axis of this case. And when we discuss forensic or procedural issues, we should do so with those human consequences in mind.
Agreed. Let's move to suspects and the endgame. Beyond Bedwell, did investigators ever have a credible prime suspect? Or did the case end up mired in a swamp of leads with no ridge to climb?
There were always persons of interest. Local men with histories of harassing girls, patrons near 36th Street and Archer, but nothing that produced the kind of forensic corroboration we need. The anonymous caller and the crossed toes detail remain tantalizing, but not conclusive. Over time, cases like this become a library of clues without a spine. Lots of evidence, no conclusive thread tying it together.
In recent decades, retired detectives like James Hennigan and citizen sleuths kept the file alive. There's also the modern context, DNA testing, cold case techniques. Has anything in the last 20 years moved the needle?
Publicly, no definitive breakthrough has been announced as of early 2026. The Cook County Sheriff's Office lists the Grimes murders as an open cold case and occasionally issues anniversary statements asking for tips. Retired detectives and online communities have been valuable for re-examining leads and crowdsourcing forgotten documents, but without preserved and exploitable DNA from proven items connected to a suspect, it's hard to convert interest into prosecutions. That said, sometimes a single phone call or a descendant's DNA can break something years later. The door shouldn't be considered closed.
I want to read a couple of lines from James Grimes, Barbara and Patricia's brother, who spoke to the Tribune in 2013. The case still pains me, particularly at Christmas time and the holidays. I wonder how many nieces and nephews I might have had if my sisters had lived. Maybe there's hope. That personal note, maybe there's hope, is why we keep doing these episodes, to try and turn hope into action. Lewis, before we go to the final act, can you sum up the strongest piece of evidence that suggests this was an abduction and murder, not a runaway?
Sure. The strongest evidence is the autopsy timing combined with the condition and placement of the bodies. Stomach contents, degree of exposure, and injury patterns indicate death occurred within hours of the sisters' last confirmed sighting at the theater. That alone makes prolonged runaway scenarios improbable. Add to that the positioning behind a guardrail, it looks like a deliberate disposal. These elements point toward abduction and homicidal intent rather than a voluntary absence that led to exposure.
Thanks, Lewis. Act 4. The aftermath and the possibilities that never had enough evidence. We're in the 1960s and beyond. Investigators age, files move, memory fades. But interest persists in former detectives and in the family. One haunting fact that doesn't seem to leave anyone alone is the anonymous man who called Loretta. If the caller was the killer, why would he call and reveal a private detail and then brag? Or was he a cruel hoaxer who somehow had inside information? Either way, it's cruelty on top of cruelty.
Those kinds of taunting calls are sadly common in high-profile cases. Some killers derive satisfaction from inserting themselves into the narrative. Others are hoaxers who harvest sensational details from the press. The crossed toes detail is difficult to explain away, but mission critical, still not proof. Whoever that man was, he wielded language like a weapon against a grieving mother.
I can't even imagine how Loretta must have felt. She also faced the press and detectives and publicly pushed against the runaway explanations. She drew attention to investigative gaps, and she never got the answer she wanted. That's important to remember. Now, some listeners may already have a theory, and there are many. Before we go, Lewis, let's run through the dominant theories and what would be needed to push one of them from plausible to likely.
Okay, Theory 1. A known local predator abducted them. To move this to likely, you'd need corroborated evidence linking a specific person to the Brighton area that night, plus some forensic or physical evidence, an object, a fingerprint, or confessions from someone with independent knowledge. Theory 2, a stranger sadist. Again, you'd need travel or employment records or someone placing that person in the city with access to the girls. Theory 3, multiple perpetrators. You'd need witness testimony that can be verified or physical evidence suggesting more than one individual was present. Theory 4, investigative failure or cover-up. That requires proof of deliberate withholding of evidence or records showing that leads were buried. Finally, the runaway theory, largely discredited, would require credible evidence that the girls were alive for weeks and then died accidentally, which conflicts with autopsy timing. None of these currently have that kind of conclusive support.
So, we're back to an open file and a set of locked doors. One thing I'd like to stress: when we retell this story, we mustn't indulge in cheap thrills. These were real people, and their family has lived with this. We owe them sober reporting. Lewis, can you speak to the ethical responsibilities of telling cases like this, especially with gaps and contradictions?
We must avoid sensationalizing, avoid repeating misogynistic rumor as fact, and be transparent about what is known and what is speculation. Use the victims' names. Don't reduce them to headlines. State the evidence that supports conclusions and the evidence that contradicts them. And remember that storytelling has consequences for living relatives. When mistakes are made in reporting, they can reopen wounds.
Absolutely. We've talked about the case's details. Now I want to take a breath and place it in context. Chicago in the 1950s. Post-war shifts, industrial neighborhoods, strict Catholic morality, rising anxieties about youth. The Grimes sisters' deaths fit into a wider pattern. The city had seen other child murders, and the public reaction was shaped by cultural fear. That fear influenced how police and media told the story. Lewis, what lessons should modern detectives and journalists take from this case?
Several. First, don't let cultural narratives about music, gender, or class drive investigative priorities. Second, secure proper scene control and protect the integrity of interviews. Third, treat confessions skeptically and corroborate them scientifically. Fourth, communicate with families honestly and respectfully. And finally, preserve physical evidence properly so that future technologies, like DNA, can be applied.
We often close these episodes by asking, what, concretely, might change the status of this case? What single development would have the most impact?
A preserved piece of physical evidence, a garment, a hair, a cigarette butt, something tied to the crime scene or a likely suspect that can be matched to living relatives via DNA. Absent that, a credible witness who didn't speak before, someone now willing to testify about specific, verifiable facts, could change everything. But both are unlikely after so many decades, which is not to say impossible.
Before we sign off, I want to read something from Harry Gloss that has stuck with me. He wrote, later in his career, that the official file contained details the public was never told, and that, to his mind, the girls were beaten and tortured. He believed their deaths were not simple exposure. Those words haunt me because they suggest institutional choices about what to reveal and what to withhold. Lewis, final thought?
My final thought is this. The Grimes case is emblematic of a familiar pattern. Victims' lives overshadowed by spectacle, early investigative errors that echo for decades, and a family left with questions. But the case is also a call to perseverance. Cold cases are sometimes solved years later by small actions. Someone running an old driver's license list, a relative taking a DNA test, or a retired cop revisiting a file. Maybe there's hope is not a naive phrase. It's the engine of cold case work.
Thank you, Lewis. And thank you all for listening. If you're in Chicago and you have information about the Grimes case, something you haven't shared before, please reach out to the Cook County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit. We'll put a link in the episode description. This story resists closure, but telling it carefully keeps the memory of Barbara and Patricia alive as more than a headline. They were a sister and a sister in a small apartment on South Damon with Elvis posters on the wall who went to the movies and never came home. Next week on Still Unanswered, we look at modern investigative techniques and how cold cases are actually solved decades later. For Dr. Lewis Harrigan, I'm Claire Mendoza. Good night.
Good night, Claire. Good night. Good night.